Kevin McCullough.
Final few minutes with Jay Greene of the Heritage Foundation, and very glad to have him with us. Jay, this is some mind-blowing, eye-opening stuff that you're telling us, but it basically amounts to people that know how to do it robbing the American people blind on grants and saying that things cost way more than they cost. And they're telling us that they need it for their research, when in reality they're paying very little on what they're calling overhead, and then they're using the rest of it to back other causes. You were just beginning to touch, though, on how hospitals are in this equation, and I want you to pick up from where we left off there, because it's not just the universities that are benefiting.
Sure. I mean, so scientific research does yield innovations in pharmaceuticals, innovations in surgical procedures, and we do benefit from those innovations. However, there are private companies that also benefit from those innovations. It results in drugs that major pharmaceutical companies then sell to us. So we pay for the innovation multiple times. We pay for it when we pay for the overhead on the research, and then the research, and then again when we have to pay the pharmaceutical companies or the hospital chains for those innovations when we receive the drugs or the procedures. And so the question is, how many times are taxpayers going to have to pay for this? There's also the matter that we also pay for it when we give taxes to our state government to appropriate money to the state university to build their buildings. And we're paying for those buildings again. Or when private donors give money to the university, then they're also getting those buildings paid for. So how many times are we going to pay for the same building? There are expensive pieces of equipment used in research, but those can be allocated specifically to the research projects and made a direct expense of the research, not an overhead expense. The problem with overhead expense is that it's unaccountable. It's a slush fund that administrators use for whatever they want.
What are some of the things that we've caught them using it for?
So, I mean, this was a couple decades ago, but Stanford was using this overhead money to purchase a yacht, to redecorate the office of their president. I mean, so there's that kind of like obvious corruption.
Well, doesn't that benefit the quality of the research to buy
Sure.
a yacht?
Well, maybe they take out donors on the yacht and it helps them raise money. But these things are not really related to research, is the point.
Or actual overhead.
Right, actual overhead. And they're also using it currently. I mean, Columbia University currently brags that it uses the money to cross-subsidize PhDs in the humanities. Well, you know, the money's not for that. The money's supposed to be for conducting research on medical science. And it's not a slush fund for universities to decide that, you know, it wants to have PhDs in colonial studies or, you know, gender studies or whatever it wants to have, and that we're supposed to pay for it through tax dollars in the NIH.
Did I read, and maybe it wasn't NIH, but I thought I read something this last week that one of the major universities, and I think it may have been Columbia, were actually using either NIH grants or maybe USAID or something, FEMA, something. It was coming from somewhere, maybe Department of Education. And they actually didn't have a line item for what they claimed they needed it for, but they were pouring it into DEI and political awareness activism on their campus in ways that I don't think that you're supposed to do that with that type of funding.
We actually have observed that for every $100 million in overhead that universities get, they hire an additional 15.5 DEI staff. So that tells you one of the things they're doing with this extra money is they're building out their DEI bureaucracy. So they whatever kind of nonsense they wish to indulge, they can do it with this slush fund of taxpayers.
And the problem is primarily that money is not specifically allocated for something direct. Like if they had a receipt and said, we need this computer that does this and it costs this much, that would be more explainable than just saying,
that's right.
This is what we're doing.
We want accountability. Accountability means that if researchers need expensive equipment or expensive labs, they should itemize those expenses more and not just list them in overhead or claim they're in overhead, and then you actually use that overhead as a slot fund for other things.
So what's the solution here? How do we pull this back? How do we fix it?
So the Trump administration has said they're not going to pay 60 cents on the dollar for overhead. They're going to pay 15 cents on the dollar. And now a federal judge has put this on hold with an injunction yesterday. Um,
Why? Does the judge
22.
not live in America? Does he love throwing just throw money into the fireplace, please?
So I think some of the dispute is over the application of this reduction to already existing grants. So there may be a dispute about whether there has been a contract already made and whether that contract can be changed. And honestly, this is beyond my depths of legal understanding.
Right.
But it feels to me like this is going to somehow get worked out. Eventually, the Trump administration's clever, and I think that they understand how to have an opening bid and then figure out how to get to a good solution. And I think that they have signaled to the universities that they need to cut out this nonsense. And one way or another, it is going to get reduced. And we're going to see something closer to 15 cents on the dollar than 60 cents on the dollar.
I mean, I hate to sound like the real, cheapwad that I probably am, but like, I don't want to give them 15 cents on the dollar if I still don't know where it's going. Like, I would like to see electric bills and, your broadband bill and let's make them cough up the actual proof of what that overhead stuff is running before we cut them anything. Make them pay in advance and we reimburse them. That's what normal companies do when employees have expenses. They spend out of pocket and then the company reimburses them, but they get a receipt and they get a date and a time and something that happened and they have an ability to prove it. We certainly should have that kind of expectation from a government that has been so wildly out of control.
So the challenge is that overhead is supposed to be stuff that you can't easily allocate to a specific project. So if it's a general expense, like if they have roads that go through the university and which research project benefits from which portion of the road, there are things that are hard to allocate. The question is, how much of that is there? They can allocate actually more than they currently are, and being forced to itemize their expenses makes them more accountable because then they have to produce the receipts.
That's what I like.
Spent it on that.
That's what you and I have to do before that IRS rebate check comes. Anyway, Jay Greene doing fantastic work with the Heritage Foundation. Thanks for breaking all this down for us. Really appreciate it.
Sure thing. Thanks for having me on.
You got it. Kevin McCullough coming right back from Times Square. Don't go away.
Stick around for more of That Kevin. Next, That Kevin Show with Kevin McCullough.